Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where forgotten pieces of history come alive. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the stories that shaped our past. Now let us step back into 1946 to uncover the chilling tale of America's most twisted family and the 7 daughters betrayed by the man who should have protected them. In the small towns of America, the years after the war were supposed to be years of healing, the years when families came together again, when fathers returned from Europe and the Pacific, and mothers once again set their tables for suppers filled with laughter and light. It was supposed to be a time when children played in the fields without fear, and the promise of the American dream seemed so near you could almost touch it. The world had endured fire and loss, and in 1946, there was a sense of relief in the air, a fragile hope rising from the ashes of battlefields and ration books. Yet as much as the papers told stories of victory parades and new beginnings behind closed doors in certain homes, there were other stories no one wanted to print, stories no one dared whisper out loud for fear that their very souls would tremble. One such story came from a quiet corner of America, where the facade of a simple, hard-working family masked a darkness so deep it would shake those who learned it to their core. In this family, there were 7 daughters, bright-eyed and innocent children who should have known the warmth of their father's protection and the comfort of their mother's embrace. They lived on the edge of a town, in a weathered farmhouse that looked no different from any other wooden house, with peeling paint and a porch where one might expect to see rocking chairs lined up in the evening. The road to the house was dusty, the fields stretched wide, and the barn stood tall against the sky. To an outsider, it seemed like a place of humble life, the kind of place where corn grew tall and the rooster's crow marked the rhythm of every morning. But inside those walls, another rhythm beat, one made not of love or laughter, but of fear. Whispers and shadows. The man of the house, their father, carried himself in public as a figure of stern respect. He was the kind of man neighbors nodded to, though not many dared to linger in conversation. His face was hard, his eyes cold, but in that era, many men had a hardness about them, and people rarely questioned what went on behind closed doors. The war had left many broken and distant, and no one wanted to meddle. But what this father carried inside him was not the silence of a soldier or the fatigue of a worker. It was something darker, something that turned his home into a private prison for his daughters. From the youngest to the oldest, each girl learned quickly that their father's authority was absolute. He ruled the house with commands that brooked no question. Meals were eaten in silence. The scrape of a fork or the clink of a glass seemed louder than words. The mother moved about like a shadow, her voice never rising above a whisper, her eyes always downcast, as if afraid that if she met her daughter's eyes, she might break down completely. The daughters themselves grew up in a world where play was forbidden, where laughter was stifled before it could escape, where their every step was measured and watched. It is easy to imagine the little girls once playing in the yard before the darkness grew too heavy, the swing set creaking with their voices drifting on the wind. But as the years passed, those sounds vanished, replaced by quiet tension. The Iwata's footsteps on the floorboards carried dread with them, each creak a reminder that his presence was near. He was a man who did not need to shout to command fear. His silence carried more weight than 100 words. His stare cut deeper than any whip, but the cruelty he held went beyond silence and sternness. It crossed into a territory that no father should ever dare to cross. He began with one daughter, then another, taking what was never his to take, stealing innocence in the most vile way a man could do. The daughters had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Each night was a battlefield without trenches. Each morning, a survival without victory. The farmhouse became a cage, and their father, its warden. He twisted their very sense of family, turning the place that should have been a sanctuary into a nightmare that repeated with every passing season. The community did not know, or perhaps did not want to know. Small towns have a way of looking the other way, of pretending that what happens on one family's land is not their business. The girls went to church, sometimes sat in the pews with bowed heads, their dresses neatly pressed, but if anyone looked close enough, they might have seen the fear in their eyes. Might have noticed the way they flinched at a sudden sound, but people saw only what they wanted to see: good Christian. Girls with a stern father and a quiet mother, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that needed asking about in those days. Shame and lay. Silence walked hand in hand, and so the daughters carried their secret like a stone tied to their hearts as the years past. The unthinkable happened. The daughters began to bear children of their own, but these were not children born of love or of youthful mistakes. They were the offspring of their father's crimes. Each baby born under that roof added to the weight of the secret, a twisted legacy that grew louder even as the family worked to keep it hidden. Neighbors saw the growing number of infants and whispered behind hands. Some muttered about loose morals. Others wondered why no suitors ever came calling, but few dared to ask directly. The mother held the children close, rocking them with a hollow look in her eyes, while the father carried on as if nothing had changed. He walked to town, he worked the fields, he nodded at the grocer, and spoke in curt tones to the men at the feed store. No one would have believed that in his home he had created a family built on betrayal. The daughters bore their pain in silence. Some of them barely more than children themselves, raising babies they never asked for. The bonds of sisterhood became both their salvation and their prison. They leaned on each other in the quiet moments, whispered comfort when the nights grew too heavy, but they also shared the burden of fear. They were trapped together in a house where innocence had no chance to survive. Each child born became both a reminder of what was stolen and a fragile hope that maybe someday someone would listen. Someone would see. By 1946, the war was over, and America was celebrating new beginnings. But in that farmhouse, time seemed to stand still while the rest of the nation embraced prosperity and joy. This family carried its shadow like a shroud. The father's power remained unbroken, the daughter's silence unbroken too. But silence can never last forever. The cracks were there. Though faint at first, one daughter's eyes began to look beyond the fields toward the horizon. Another daughter's hands trembled less when she held her baby, as if a flicker of strength was returning. The youngest among them watched and waited, perhaps not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of what was wrong. In small-town secrets can last for decades, but they can also unravel with astonishing speed. One word spoken in the wrong ear, one cry overheard, one unexpected visitor arriving at the wrong time. Sometimes fate has a way of stepping into the shadows and dragging the truth into the light. And in this family's case, the light was coming, though none of them yet knew how. The story of the 7 daughters is not one of quick rescue or sudden justice. It is a story of long suffering, of a silence so deep it nearly consumed them. But it is also a story of strength, though buried beneath years of fear and shame. It is the story of innocence, stolen, and the long, painful road toward being heard. The year 1946 would not only mark the end of a world war, it would also mark the beginning of a war inside a single house, a war fought not with guns or tanks, but with voices breaking through silence with courage, standing against cruelty with daughters who refused to remain shadows forever. And so as the dust settled on that year, and the nation moved forward, the seeds of exposure were quietly being sown in that broken household. What had been hidden in whispers and locked inside wooden walls would not remain forever hidden. The world outside was about to learn the truth, a truth that would shock and horrify, a truth that would forever mark the story of America's most twisted family, a truth of 7 daughters betrayed. The year 1946 rolled on with parades and dances, and soldiers returning home with medals pinned to their jackets. Mothers hung fresh curtains on their windows, and boys filled the streets with baseball bats and laughter. It was a year that promised better days, but in that farmhouse, the promises of the outside world meant little. The daughters still lived under their father's rule, still whispered their pain in the shadows, still carried babies they had never chosen. The war outside might Have ended, but theirs had not the man at the center of it. All grew more comfortable in his secrecy. Years of unchecked power had made him bold. He walked through the house like a king in his own twisted kingdom, his voice low but heavy with command. No daughter dared refuse him, no word of protest passed their lips, and yet cracks continued to form, though he could not see them, for a man like him believed his power eternal. He believed silence was loyalty when in truth silence was only survival. Neighbors began to notice things, though they never said them out loud. To many children in that house, too many daughters who never courted boys in town, too many eyes that looked hollow when they should have sparkled. The gossip passed in whispers around churchyards and market stalls. Some thought the girls were simply loose, that their father was too weak to discipline them. Others thought perhaps the mother herself was to blame, too frail or too quiet to keep her daughters in line. The truth, too monstrous to even cross their minds, but suspicion, even if misguided, has a way of sharpening, and though no one yet guessed the real crime, the unease was spreading inside the house. The daughters carried their burdens like ghosts, their arms cradling babies while their own childhood slipped away. They grew into mothers before they ever had the chance to be young women. The older sisters took on the weight of caretaking, rocking infants through the night, while the younger ones tried to shield their own fragile innocence as long as they could. Though innocence in that house was never safe, they spoke little of their pain, but each glance exchanged at the dinner table, each squeeze of a hand, each quiet tear shed in the dark, was a language all their own. They understood each other in silence more than anyone outside could ever understand. The mother of the house drifted through her days like a shadow, her face lined with sorrow deeper than her years. She too was trapped, though in her case it was a trap built not only of fear but of duty and shame. She had married young. She had stood beside this man in church as he spoke vows that meant nothing to him. She had raised daughters with the belief that she was building a family, only to watch as her husband destroyed it from within. She saw the growing children, the strange resemblance, the evidence she could never erase from her mind, yet still she said nothing. Her silence was its own crime, though one born from terror and hopelessness. She feared what would happen if she spoke, feared for her daughters, feared for herself, and so she moved like a ghost, keeping her eyes down, keeping her heart locked tight. But silence, like a river held too long behind a dam, cannot last forever. Eventually, the cracks spread wider. One of the older daughters found within herself a flicker of defiance. She began to imagine a life beyond the farm, a life where her children could play in open fields without fear, where her sisters could breathe without dread. She began to dream dangerous dreams, dreams of leaving, of telling someone, of breaking the silence. And though the fear in her heart was heavy, the thought of staying grew heavier still. Her small acts of defiance were quiet at first, a glance held too long, a question asked in a tone too sharp. Once she even pulled away from her father's hand, and though his rage that night was cold and merciless, the act planted something in her, a seed that whispered that resistance, however small, was possible. She shared her thoughts in hushed whispers with one sister, then another, each afraid, each trembling, but each listening to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the walls of their prison could someday be broken. It was around this time that one of the daughters made a mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake at all. Perhaps it was fate. She spoke too freely to a woman in town, an older neighbor, who had once least offered her bread and kindness. The girl let slip a word, too heavy, a look too sorrowful, and though she quickly covered it with a smile, the woman saw through it. Small towns breed keen eyes and sharper instincts. The woman did not know what she had glimpsed, but she knew it was something terrible, something festering behind those farmhouse walls. She spoke of it quietly to her husband that night, and though he shook his head and told her not to meddle, she could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Rumors took root in whispers in the community, now sharper and darker than before. One man swore he had seen too many babies in that house for one family to explain. Another wondered aloud why None of the daughters ever seemed to take husbands. Why no suitors came calling? Some whispered it was a curse, some thought madness, some thought nothing at all, but the whispers grew, and once whispers take hold in a small town, they rarely fade away. Meanwhile, the daughters carried their lives forward, one season into the next, their children growing their fears, deepening their father still ruling with iron silence, but within them grew a strength born of survival. Each child they raised each night they endured carved into them a resilience that no cruelty could erase. They were victims, yes, but they were also more than that. They were survivors, and though they did not yet know it, survivors carry a fire that can never fully be extinguished by the fall of 1946. The air in the town had grown heavy with suspicion, though no one yet spoke the truth aloud. The local pastor visited the farmhouse one afternoon, offering words of faith and prayer, his eyes scanning the daughters, the children, the weary mother he left, with a weight in his chest that he could not name. But he prayed harder that night than he had in many years, for sometimes men of God see what others refuse to see, and though he did not yet act, the seed of concern had been planted, and still the father walked among them as if untouchable. He believed the world would never look too closely. He believed his daughters too afraid, too broken to ever reveal his sins. But pride blinds the wicked, and it blinded him most of all. He could not see the way the tide was turning. He could not feel the change in the air. He could not hear the voices gathering strength in the silence. The daughters were beginning to understand something vital. They had endured for years. They had been broken down to shadows, but they were still together. They had each other, and together they might someday have enough courage to break the silence. They began to imagine the unthinkable, telling the truth, speaking the words that had been locked in their throats for so long. They feared what would come of it. They feared the wrath of their father. They feared the shame of their community, but they also feared something greater, the fear that if they said nothing, the cycle would never end. The darkness would stretch into another generation. Their children would grow under the same shadow, and that was a fear heavier than all the rest. The house stood silent on the fields that autumn, the winds carrying the smell of smoke, and harvest, the community, carried its whispers. The pastor carried his unease. The daughters carried their courage quietly building, and the father carried his sins blind to the gathering storm. The stage was set, though no one could yet see it. The threads of silence and suspicion were weaving together into something that would not stay hidden much longer. The year of Slash High, the year of still had more to reveal, and the world outside those farmhouse walls was about to learn the story that would shock them all. Winter came to the town that year with a sharp bite, the kind of cold that crept into bones and made every sound carry further across the frosted fields. Smoke curled from chimneys, and families huddled together around wood stoves, reading scripture, telling stories, laughing through the short days and long nights. For most, it was a season of closeness, but inside that farmhouse, winter only. Deep in the silence, the cold air outside seemed to press against the windows, as if listening to the sorrow within. The father's rule carried on unbroken, his footsteps heavy on the creaking boards, his daughters trapped in the endless cycle of fear, obedience, and betrayal. The children born into that darkness grew restless. They were too young to know the full truth, but children sense what words cannot explain. They saw the weariness in their mothers' eyes, the way laughter died quickly, the way joy never lingered long. They felt the tension in every meal, in every bedtime, in every moment there. Small voices sometimes rose in innocent play, only to be silenced quickly by the weight that hung over the house, and so even their childhoods were bound in the same web that had ensnared their mothers'. Butt cracks were spreading faster now. Whispers in town grew sharper than ever. People began to notice how the girls never seemed to leave the farm unless in pairs or under the watchful eye of their father. They noticed how one daughter, who had been seen as lively and bright years ago, now walked with her head low and her shoulders bent as though carrying a weight no one could name. The pastor's wife mentioned it quietly to a neighbor, who mentioned it to another. Soon the quiet unease grew into questions that could not be shaken. One evening, As the snow fell heavy and the roads turned slick, one of the daughters stood at the window, her baby cradled in her arms. She stared out at the dark horizon, her breath fogging the glass. She thought of the world beyond the farm, of the towns lit with Christmas lights, of families gathering with joy instead of fear. She thought of a life she had never known but longed for with all her heart. In that moment, something shifted. She whispered to the infant in her arms words that had never before been spoken aloud, that someday she would find a way to leave, that someday she would not let this darkness consume them all. It was a vow made quietly in the night, but one that would echo louder with each passing day. The father, of course, remained blind to it all, blinded by pride and cruelty. He believed himself untouchable. He believed no one would ever question him. His daughters, too broken to resist his wife, too silent to betray him. The community too polite to interfere. But it is often when men believe themselves strongest that they are nearest to their fall. It was in early 1947 when a chance encounter began to unravel everything. One of the younger daughters, sent on an errand into town, lingered longer than usual at the shop. The grocer, a kindly man who had watched the children of the town grow for decades, noticed her hesitation. He noticed her bruised wrist, the way her voice caught when she answered his simple questions. His heart tightened, though he said nothing aloud. The girl left quickly, clutching the items her father had demanded. But the image lingered with the grocer. Long after he locked up that, he told his wife in a low voice, and she told another. Soon the whispers had shaped, the whispers had teeth. Pastor too could no longer ignore what he felt in his heart. He returned to the farmhouse under the guise of offering prayer for the family. He sat in their kitchen, the daughters standing stiff, the mother quiet, the father looming over them. And though no one spoke of the truth, the pastor saw enough in their eyes. He left that day more troubled than ever, and though bound by the customs of his time, and by fear of accusing without proof, he prayed harder still that God would reveal what was hidden. The daughters, meanwhile, grew closer in their silent bond. One night, as the wind howled outside, they gathered in the smallest bedroom, the babies asleep, the floorboards creaking under their weight. They spoke in whispers words that had long been buried. One of them finally said it aloud, naming the evil their father had done. The others nodded, tears spilling down their cheeks, though they had never spoken it before. They had all known it together. They made a pact that night, though still trembling with fear, that if the chance came, they would speak the truth. They would not let their children grow under the same shadow. Night marked a turning point. Silence was no longer enough. Endurance was no longer enough. They were still trapped, but their hearts had begun to change. Once a victim begins to believe in the possibility of freedom, no matter how faint it becomes, a force stronger than fear itself made it. Was a visiting relative who became the spark. The mother's distant cousin arrived unexpectedly one afternoon, bringing small gifts for the children and pies for the family. She stayed only an hour, but in that short time she noticed too much. She saw the pale faces of the daughters, the way the children clung to tightly. She saw the way the father's presence filled the room like a storm cloud. She said nothing, but when she returned home, she carried the heaviness with her, and unlike the townsfolk, who only whispered, she decided she would not let the feeling rest. She began to write letters, first to the pastor, then to county officials, letters filled with worry and suspicion. Not accusation, but concern. Enough to make people pay attention. The first knock on the farmhouse door from an official came weeks later, a county welfare worker sent to inquire politely about the children. The father bristled, but allowed her inside. The daughters stood silent, their eyes down, the mother clutching a baby to her chest. The welfare worker asked questions. Simple questions about schooling and health. The father answered in curt tones, and the daughters nodded as commanded. But the worker noticed the silence. She noticed the fear. She noticed that not one child smiled. Not one daughter lifted her eyes. When she left that day, she carried with her a report that would mark the beginning of the end. The father grew suspicious after that visit. His temper sharper, his punishments crueler. He sensed the outside world pressing closer, and though he tried To tighten his grip, fear had already loosened it. His daughters now knew that others were watching, others were wondering, others were listening. The walls of silence that had protected him for so long were beginning to crumble, and once they began, there was no stopping them, for silence can hold many years, but once broken, it can roar louder than any storm. And in that farmhouse, in that winter of 1947, the roar was coming closer with every passing day. Spring came to the fields with green shoots pushing through the soil, the kind of season when most families opened their windows to let the fresh air in, when children chased each other through meadows and mothers hung wash on lines to dry in the warm sun. But in that farmhouse, spring carried no joy. The father grew restless. He sensed change. He felt the eyes of the town upon him, though no one had spoken the truth aloud. He knew whispers were circling like crows overhead. He grew sharper with his daughters, more watchful of their movements, more demanding of their silence. Yet what he did not see was that silence had already broken inside them. What had once been a prison of fear had become a fire of defiance. The county officials returned again that spring, another welfare worker, this time with a sharper eye and firmer questions. She asked the daughters about their schooling, their health, their futures. The futures the father answered for them, as always, but the worker pressed. She noticed how the oldest daughter's hands shook when she poured water, how the youngest clung to her sister's dress with wide, frightened eyes. The worker left with more than she came with. She left with suspicion that could not be dismissed. She filed her report, and for the first time the machinery of authority began to turn. But change never comes gently in families bound by fear. The father sensed the danger. He raged in the nights, pacing the floorboards, slamming doors, his voice sharp as a whip. The daughters cowered, but they no longer broke in silence behind their tears. There was now resolve, and once resolve takes root, it cannot be undone. They comforted each other in whispers. They told their children to be strong. They held to the fragile belief that the world beyond the farmhouse was finally listening. Was the pastor who became the first to speak aloud the words that others had feared. He brought his concerns to the sheriff, a man not quick to act without reason, but also not one to turn his back on trouble. The sheriff listened. He frowned. He weighed the words. Then he too began to watch. He drove past the farmhouse more often than usual. He asked quiet questions of neighbors. He paid attention to details others had overlooked. And slowly, a picture formed, one that chilled him to the bone. The confrontation, when it came, was sudden and heavy. The sheriff arrived at the farmhouse with 2 deputies in the late afternoon, the sun still high, the air filled with the buzzing of spring insects. The father met them at the door, his jaw tight, his eyes narrow, but the sheriff did not flinch. He stepped inside, demanded to speak with the daughters one by one. The father tried to resist, tried to control the scene, but the deputies held firm, and for the first time in their lives, the daughters found themselves in the presence of authority that was not their father. The words came halting at first, trembling, broken by tears, but once spoken, they could not be stopped. The daughters told their truth, their voices carrying years of silence, their confessions filling the room with horror. They spoke of nights stolen, of innocence lost, of children born not of love, but of violation. They spoke of a father who had betrayed them in the most unforgivable way. The deputies stood pale and grim. The sheriff's jaw set, his heart burning with rage. When the father tried to speak, when he tried to deny, the sheriff silenced him with a voice cold as iron. The truth was no longer his to hide. The arrest shook the community like thunder. Word spread faster than fire through dry grass. Neighbors who had once whispered now gaped in disbelief. The grocer who had noticed the bruises, the pastor's wife who had felt the unease, the older woman who had suspected all of them now pieced together the truth, and the truth was worse than any of them had ever imagined. A father who had stolen the lives of his 7 daughters, a family twisted into something unholy behind closed doors. The town reeled in shock. Some wept, some raged, some refused to believe, but none could look away. Their daughters, now free from the shadow of their father, faced a different kind of storm. They faced the eyes of their community, eyes that judged eyes, that calloused eyes, that pitied eyes that struggled to understand they carried their children in their arms, children who bore the marks of their lineage, and they wondered what future could ever come of such beginnings. Yet within them there was also strength to survive. Such horror and still speak such truth is itself a kind of victory. The trial that followed laid bare details that chilled every heart it spoke of. Years of abuse of innocence, stolen again and again, it spoke of a man who had believed himself untouchable, and of daughters who had endured the unendurable, the courtroom air heavy with sorrow and outrage. Reporters came from nearby towns, their pens scratching furiously their papers, printing headlines that stunned readers who could not fathom such betrayal. The father sat stone-faced, his eyes cold, but his power gone forever, stripped by the words of those he had silenced for so long, though. Jury did not take long to deliver its judgment. Guilty, the word rang like a bell through the courthouse. The daughters wept, the mother lowered her head, the town stood in silence. Justice, though heavy, had at last been spoken. The father was led away, shackled not just by iron, but by the weight of his own sins, and for the first time in years, the farmhouse, though still scarred, stood free of his shadow. The years that followed were not easy healing, never come swiftly for wounds carved so deep. The daughters carried scars that no court could erase. They raised their children with both love and sorrow, their lives shaped by the past, but not wholly defined by it. Some left the town seeking fresh beginnings. Others stayed trying to carve a place for themselves among neighbors who struggled to look them in the eye. Yet they endured, for endurance had always been their greatest strength. Community, too, carried the weight of the truth. People who had looked away, who had whispered, but never acted, lived with the shame of their silence. Some sought forgiveness in prayer, some in charity, some in tears at the edges of conversations. For when evil festers in a community, it is never only the hand that commits it, but also the eyes that refuse to see, that bear the burden. Farmhouse itself stood for years, weathered and worn, its paint peeling its windows. Clouded people passed it on the road. With a shiver, mothers pointed it out to children as a warning. Fathers muttered about the darkness that had lived there. It became not just a house, but a symbol, a reminder that even in quiet towns, even in years of peace, horrors can hide behind doors closed too tightly. And yet within the story of betrayal, there is also a story of courage. For the daughters, though broken by their father, found the strength to speak. They found the will to break silence. They faced judgment and sorrow, but they refused to remain shadows. They gave voice to suffering that many would never have believed, and in doing so, they tore down the walls of a prison that had lasted far too long. History remembers many things, wars and victories, leaders and monuments, but sometimes the most important stories are those buried in quiet towns, the stories of families twisted by cruelty, the stories of voices long silenced, then finally heard. The story of 7 daughters betrayed by the man who should have been their protector is one such story. It is a story that reminds us that evil can hide anywhere, that silence can protect the guilty, and that courage, though fragile, can change everything. So as the years pass and the details fade, what remains is the lesson that no darkness lasts forever. No secret can remain hidden when voices rise. No cruelty, no matter how powerful, can silence truth forever. The daughters of that farmhouse proved it when they spoke their pain into the world, and though their scars remained, their voices carried a strength greater than their father's cruelty in the end. And so the tale of America's most twisted family became more than a story of betrayal. It became a story of survival, a story of courage born in shadows, a story that still echoes through history, reminding us all that truth, even whispered, even trembling, has the power to break chains.